When a young Hawaiian woman leaves a dinner party on a torrentially rainy night, the journey turns deadly, and not because of the weather. Fear grips the island of Oahu as police search for a killer within their own ranks in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This is the revisited and enhanced edition of one of our early episodes, which features the unsolved homicide of Lisa Au. The original edition was recorded in 2020, and we've revisited and re-recorded an episode on her case in 2025. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening since the early days of Last Seen Alive have noticed, our production and audio quality have improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the best we knew how at the time. However, our best wasn't the best, and we've learned a lot since then. We want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So, we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes, including this one. A quick heads up. This episode contains brief mention of the subject of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Lisa Au was last seen alive on January 22, 1982. She was 19 years old at the time and lived in Kailua Beach on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Lisa had grown up on the island, and at 19 years old, she was at an exciting point in her life where there were a lot of new beginnings, a lot of new steps toward independence, and the shaping of her adult life. She'd recently graduated from beauty college and had landed a job as a hairstylist at a local salon, the Susan Beers Salon, where she'd styled hair just a stone's throw from the turquoise waters that ebb against the shore of Kailua Beach. By late January, she'd been working at the salon for just over a month. She'd also recently begun driving, which had allowed her greater independence, freeing her to travel independently to and from work and social activities. On the night of January 21st, it was the latter that she traveled to in her 1976 Toyota. At the time, Lisa was dating a local college student named Doug. Doug's sister, Kristen, lived in Makiki, which is an area of Honolulu that's about a 20-minute drive from Kailua, where Lisa lived and worked. That evening, Kristen invited Doug, who lived on the University of Hawaii campus, and Lisa over for dinner. They both happily accepted the invitation. Lisa's mom, Patrice, hadn't wanted Lisa to go and had tried to caution her against it. Not because she had a problem with Doug or Kristen, but because of the weather that night. It was raining torrentially, so heavily, in fact, that in some areas it was causing landslides and flooding. Patrice hated the idea of her daughter, a brand new driver who'd just gotten her license 2 days before, hitting the road during the storm. When Lisa spoke to her on the phone that day and told her about her dinner plans, she begged her to stay home and save dinner at Kristen's for another night. But Lisa was an adult and she wanted to go. So after wrapping up her day at the salon, she climbed into her Toyota and headed toward Makiki at approximately 9:45 p.m. On her way there, she stopped at a store to purchase a hostess gift. She picked out some sashimi and a bowl of poke and continued on her way. Despite the heavy rain, her drive went without incident and she arrived at Kristen's apartment, maybe a little damp, but safely in one piece and with her gifts in hand. At some point during their time at Kristen's, Lisa and Doug got into an argument. At around 11 p.m., they disagreed about something, and their loud disagreement was partially witnessed by a security guard monitoring the apartment complex. While arguments are far from unheard of among teenage couples, this one was different. One that no one would ever forget because it was one of the last conversations anyone ever had with Lisa. By midnight, Lisa was ready to leave. She'd put in a long day at the salon, and it was late. Between those facts and the argument with Doug, she was exhausted and realized that she needed to leave while she was alert enough to navigate home during the storm. The rain was still pouring down. So she used the phone in Kristen's apartment to call her roommate and tell her that she was about to start driving home. Then she got into her Toyota while Doug got into his own car. Lisa planned to return home to Kailua, and Doug would head home to his dorm room at the University of Hawaii where he was studying engineering. Doug's drive would be short. His sister Kristen's place was close to campus. What Lisa didn't know, couldn't have known at the time, was that although Doug would make it home safely, she wouldn't. For her, the storm raging over the island might as well have been a portent, a harbinger of what was to come. She wouldn't live to see the sun rise over Oahu, would never experience another dinner, another argument, or another phone call with her mom. That storm would be the soundtrack to her murder, a crime that would send shockwaves through the island and puzzle not just Hawaiians, but people around the world for decades to come. It was her roommate who first realized that something was wrong. According to an article from the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, when several hours passed after that phone call Lisa had made to her roommate, she became worried. Even in heavy rain, there was no way that the drive from Kristen's apartment to their own, which normally took only about 20 minutes, could take hours. Lisa's roommate wondered, had Lisa wrecked her car on the slick roads or maybe even been swept away by flooding or a mudslide? Given the storm, the scenarios were more than plausible, and so her roommate called the police and reported her missing. When Lisa's parents found out that she hadn't made it home that night, they of course were worried too. For Patrice, who'd begged her daughter not to drive in the storm the night before, it must have seemed as if her worst fears were coming true. And Doug, Lisa's boyfriend, who her roommate also called to notify, was also concerned. In the morning, when he found out that Lisa hadn't made it home the night before, he got back into his car and began to drive the route home she'd planned to take the night before, searching for any sign of her. Although he didn't find Lisa, he did find something else, her car. Doug discovered Lisa's car sitting abandoned alongside a Kailua highway near an old drive-in theater. According to an article by Brian Seiler for the Honolulu Star-Tribune, Lisa's car lights and windshield wipers were still on. There was no sign of Lisa inside the car or outside in the surrounding area, for that matter. Doug called the police to report his discovery, and when an officer responded to the scene, he noted something interesting about the inside of Lisa's car. The officer dispatched to the roadside noted that the driver's side window of Lisa's vehicle had been left rolled down halfway, which was strange considering that it had rained so heavily throughout the night before. As a result, the car's floor had been flooded with 2 to 3 inches of water, which were still standing when the officer arrived. The seat was completely drenched as well. The fact that the car had been left with its window down in a raging storm wasn't the strangest thing that the officer noticed, though. The strangest thing was that Lisa's purse, which was sitting on the drenched driver's seat, was completely dry.
Okay, so when you were talking about the window being down and the rain all in that, I thought that would be like one of the biggest red flags that something was going on here. But the fact that the purse is dry, that's baffling no matter how the situation goes.
Right. It clearly indicated that the purse had not been on the seat when the car had been left to weather the storm with the window rolled halfway down. If it had been, it would have been just as wet as the seat. So it must have been placed on the seat later after the rain had stopped. But when, and more importantly, by who? Those are questions that remain unanswered to this day. Investigators had forensic evidence technicians process the car, but they found that it had been wiped clean and were unable to recover any forensic evidence. Meanwhile, search parties had been deployed immediately after the discovery of Lisa's vehicle, and they weren't comprised of just law enforcement. Lisa's family and friends, along with throngs of military and civilian volunteers, also participated. Searchers combed the area surrounding the highway where Lisa's car had been found, and volunteers descended upon parking lots at shopping centers and other businesses to place flyers on cars' windshields. Everyone on the island, it seemed, knew that Lisa was missing, and everyone seemed to be coming together to find her. Their efforts were earnest and admirable, but yielded no answers. Days went by, and then a week with no sign of Lisa. Her parents waited on pins and needles, wondering if they'd receive a ransom note. After all, there had to be some explanation for why so many searchers couldn't find their daughter. Had she been abducted? Was someone holding her captive? A ransom note never came. Instead, Lisa's body was finally found 10 days after her disappearance, and Lisa's parents were faced not only with their own grief, but with the heartbreaking task of trying to explain to Lisa's then 7-year-old little sister that she would never be coming home. It wasn't a law enforcement officer, though, or a volunteer search party member who discovered Lisa's body. It was a man walking his dog on Tantalus, a mountain that offers an elevated view of the city of Honolulu. The mountain features beautiful trails that attract locals and tourists alike. Locals like the man who was enjoying a walk with his dog when he was shocked by the sight of a woman's body lying in a ravine near the top of the mountain. The location is a 14-mile, or about 22.5-kilometer, drive from where Lisa's vehicle had been found abandoned. It was much closer, actually, to where Lisa had last been seen alive, at Kristen's house. The peak of Tantalus is only a 6-mile, or a little under 10-kilometer drive from there.
It's really odd that her body was found closer to the apartment than her car. My only thought is somebody had to have taken her there or moved the car.
Right. So if she was abducted from her car where it sat on the highway near that old theater, then obviously someone got her into another vehicle and backtracked the route she'd traveled, going over to the mountain and then driving up that. And to be clear, you can drive up this mountain to the peak. You do not have to hike.
It sounds like it's probably somebody that's familiar enough with the area to be confident enough driving in that weather up that mountain to know that they could make it with relative ease.
Right, it sounds like it. Now, I've mapped out all of the significant locations in this case, and the map is up on our website, so for anyone who'd like to see that for themselves, the link is in the show notes. In any case, reporting by Charles Meminger for the Honolulu Star-Tribune states that Lisa's body, which eventually had to be identified via dental records, was found, quote, face down in tall grass as if it had been dumped by the side of the road, end quote. Lisa's abandoned body was also nude, and decomposition was already well underway in the tropical heat and humidity. In Hawaii, January is a warm and rainy month, a stark contrast to January weather in most of the United States. In fact, Hawaii is one of the few places on Earth where rainfall peaks during winter rather than summer. So there was no cold, dry winter weather buffer to preserve Lisa's remains as there might have been if she died in the American North or Midwest. In the tropics, decomposition is a quick and unforgiving process, even during winter. Lisa had been murdered. Of that, everyone was certain. But when it came to determining her cause of death, the Honolulu medical examiner eventually concluded that he couldn't pinpoint it because decomposition was too advanced. Naturally, this was frustrating for investigators. First, they hadn't been able to recover any forensic evidence from Lisa's vehicle because it had been wiped clean. And now they didn't even have a cause of death because the tropical climate had reportedly erased the evidence. The two aspects of the investigation that should have yielded the most evidence, the scene and the body, had given them very little. A quick note here on the lack of a definitive cause of death. I assume this means that Lisa was killed in a way that didn't leave clear evidence on her bones, since they, of course, would still have been intact after 10 days of decomposition. It's the soft tissue that would have broken down in the heat and humidity. Violent causes of death that leave their marks mostly or only on soft tissue might include, but aren't limited to, strangulation, suffocation, drowning, or potentially even stabbing.
Right out the gate, you hit my chief suspect, which was strangulation. Whenever we're talking about murder,
right,
most of the time that's where my mind jumps to, unless we're talking about a very violent and clearly aggressive style of stabbing.
Right. If I had to guess how she was killed, strangulation would be my first guess. Of course, I don't know. It's just a guess. Investigators might not have known how Lisa had been killed, but they knew her death had been a homicide. She clearly hadn't abducted herself from her own car, transported herself miles to the summit of Tantalus, or thrown herself into that ravine. And so, as Lisa's family grieved, investigators worked with the information they had, piecing together what they knew in an attempt to determine what had happened to the woman who'd been very loved and was very missed. It didn't take police long to generate a theory, and when the public became aware of that theory, which happened very quickly, a panic gripped the island. Scott, on the note of Lisa's purse being found on the driver's seat and appearing to have been deliberately placed there, well, investigators believed that that told them a lot about what had happened to Lisa. Not just because the purse seemed to have been placed there deliberately after the rain, but because something vital had been missing from the inside, Lisa's newly minted temporary driver's license. Now, it was the only thing missing from her purse. Her cash was still inside, untouched, indicating that her killer's motive had not been robbery. And I know, especially since we've covered this before, and we even hinted at it in the intro, There's an obvious scenario in which a driver might pull over on the side of the road, roll down their window halfway despite the rain, and get out their driver's license.
That's the only reason why I could assume somebody would be leaving their window open or even opening their window in such a storm.
Right. It's exactly what police thought. They theorized that Lisa had been pulled over by a police officer and had handed over her license. And that became their primary theory in the case, that a police officer, or someone impersonating one, had pulled Lisa over and ultimately murdered her. It was a bold move for police to publicly acknowledge that they suspected one of their own, but that's exactly what they did. Understandably, people, particularly women on Oahu, were terrified, desperately afraid that blue lights flashing in their rearview mirror would become the last thing they ever saw. People were so concerned that the local police actually banned flashing lights on the grills of unmarked police cars.
That's generally a pretty smart idea anyways, just because of the prevalence of police impersonators these days. I wouldn't be opposed to that as an idea anyways.
Well, it might not have helped to ensure safety if there really was a killer cop, since obviously they could potentially access a real police vehicle, but it would at least protect citizens from being pulled over by police impersonators. And it might protect them from being pulled over by a real police officer who was driving their private vehicle to commit crimes.
Yeah.
According to reporting for the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, numerous reports of police impersonators pulling over drivers came in around the time of Lisa's death. Whether any of those reports were ever substantiated, I'm not sure. But I do know from my own professional experience that police impersonators are far from unheard of. Additionally, according to that same reporting, Honolulu police had been receiving such reports for 5 years prior to Lisa's death, so it wasn't as if those reports didn't start coming in until after she went missing and everyone was in a panic.
Yeah, I think that's a big indicator here. I mean, obviously, I'd expect it to ramp up after.
Right, and it did, but there was still that long-established 5-year history. In fact, that article by Charles Meminger notes that investigators spoke to one man who they found to be driving around with blue lights mounted under the grille of his car. That man, who worked, and you'll be shocked, Scott, as a security guard, not as a cop, told investigators that he'd purchased the car from a police officer.
I would love to see the records of that. I mean, it's definitely easy enough to pull that as a police department. You should be able to verify that story.
Sure. I wish I knew more and could tell you more about this little detail, but I don't. I just found this mentioned as a byline in an article.
It's something that if you're dealing with this kind of issue and you do have so much pressure from the public about the police impersonators right now, that's something you need to follow up on.
Right. And they probably did, or maybe they did. I wish I knew more. I don't, so... Moving on, Lisa's missing driver's license was not the only reason that police suspected the potential involvement of one of their own. In early February, when a cashier at a local supermarket told the department that one of their officers, an Officer Byrne, had pulled her over on the same stormy night Lisa had been murdered, investigators immediately turned their attention upon that officer and suspended him from duty that very same day.
That's a pretty direct response, honestly.
Right. There was a lot of public pressure for them to identify and arrest Lisa's killer. So when someone's name was raised, they sort of just leapt into action like they were spring-loaded to do. After the name of the suspected officer was leaked, a woman came forward and claimed that Officer Byrne had sexually harassed her during a traffic stop, which she alleged that he'd made in an unmarked vehicle equipped with blue lights in the grille. And then another woman said that during a police ride-along, he'd sexually harassed her, too.
That's a lot of people coming forward.
Right. Needless to say, these accusations didn't do Officer Byrne any favors. The fact that he lived near Lisa's apartment didn't help either. The department used canines to search a lot full of the department's vehicles for Lisa's specific scent, and the dogs allegedly alerted at the vehicle Officer Byrne used.
I mean...
I know that sounds incredibly alarming initially, but there's a very important thing to note that really takes the wind out of the sails of that little detail. The canines used were actually trained for drug and bomb detection, according to the Honolulu Star-Bulletin. So how they were supposed to be helpful in detecting Lisa's scent is anyone's guess.
So these days, I would be shocked if there wasn't at least one human remains or human detection canine or tracking canine on the island. It just baffles me because of how prevalent they are and the fact that they're using bomb and drug dogs. I just have to remind myself it was in the 80s.
Yeah, so it happened in 1982. And to be honest, I know nothing about the distribution of different types of law enforcement canines over the Hawaiian Islands. So, with that being said, dogs have an amazing sense of smell. That's no secret. But training a dog to accurately detect and alert to certain scents is no small feat. It's a process that takes considerable time and professional training. The public pressure for the department to hold someone accountable for Lisa's murder was enormous, and in response, the department became hyper-focused on Officer Byrne to the point of tunnel vision. They even had the dogs inspect his house, although to the best of my knowledge, nothing came of that search, which makes sense considering that, again, the canines used were trained to detect drugs and bombs, not to track human scent or to detect the scent of decomposition. The department was so eager to close the case, even if it meant charging one of their own, that it even had one of its own officers hypnotized.
Doing that in the 80s, that is a leap.
Well, they did this because that officer had been directing traffic on the night of the storm, and they hoped that hypnosis would help him to recall whether he'd seen someone around Lisa's car, someone like their then primary suspect, Officer Byrne. It didn't work. Later, the officer who'd undergone hypnosis would claim that he'd never even noticed Lisa's car and that he'd been asked to lie to a grand jury in order to implicate his peer, Officer Byrne. He'd refused to do so and had never testified before that grand jury.
That's a big claim.
It is. Nonetheless, in August of 1982, 7 months after Lisa's murder, the aforementioned investigating grand jury was assembled to hear evidence in Lisa's case. The department hoped that the investigating grand jury would hear their evidence against Officer Byrne and decide to convene an indicting grand jury. However, that never happened. The investigating grand jury was not convinced by the evidence the department had presented, and there was good reason for that. Mainly the fact that they weren't the only ones who ended up presenting evidence to the grand jury, and that Officer Byrne wasn't the only suspect. More on that next. And now, back to Lisa's story. When Honolulu police realized that 19-year-old Lisa Al's killer had possibly been either a police officer or a police impersonator, they ended up focusing intently on one of their own to the detriment of the investigation. His name was Officer Byrne, and they presented what they considered to be their evidence against him to an investigating grand jury. The grand jury, however, was not convinced, and an indicting grand jury was never formed, and Officer Byrne was never charged with any crime in relation to Lisa's death. Notably, and unusually, police weren't the only ones allowed to testify in front of the investigating grand jury. Frustrated by the lack of progress in their daughter's case, Lisa's parents hired a former police detective turned private investigator to conduct an investigation of his own. And that former detective wasn't just any former detective. He had formerly been a Honolulu police detective and had actually been temporarily assigned to Lisa's case back when her body had first been found. His name was Bert Corneal, and he was eventually permitted to testify before the investigative grand jury despite no longer being a police officer. He believed that Officer Byrne was innocent. In fact, he felt certain that Lisa hadn't been killed by a police officer, period, and he came up with some pretty compelling evidence that he believed debunked the killer cop theory.
Before we get into his theory, I just want to point out how unusual and unique that circumstance is.
Very unusual for him to be allowed to testify.
As you know, when it comes to grand juries, they're very secretive.
Yes.
It's stuff that is not open record. It's all very hush-hush for the most part. And generally speaking, the public isn't even allowed to be in grand jury hearings.
Right. Yeah, they're not. This was an unusual circumstance. I think it was the right move for them to allow him to testify, though, because clearly the department had blinders on here with the whole Officer Byrne thing. So, Scott, of course, you remember how the driver's license was missing from Lisa's purse.
I do.
That, combined with the rolled down driver's side window, had been the red flag that had sparked suspicion of police involvement in Lisa's murder in the first place. Lisa, the department argued, had likely handed her license over to an officer who had pulled her over, and that was why it was missing. However, as it turned out, that hadn't been the case at all. During the course of his private investigation, Corneal retraced Lisa's steps on the night of her murder. One of the places he visited was the store where she'd purchased poke and sashimi, and guess what he found there?
Her license.
That's right. Lisa had paid for the food she'd bought that night with a check, and the store had required her to show her ID in order to use that method of payment. Afterward, she'd accidentally forgotten her ID at the checkout, so she hadn't handed her license over to an officer at all. Corneal's discovery proved that it would have been impossible for her to do so.
Okay, playing devil's advocate here, that would make it easier to convince her to get out of the car if she didn't have it.
I could see that being used to manipulate her.
I can see that aspect and why she would have still rolled down her window to talk to someone. But that being said, it does kind of help create that buffer because it proves that they didn't do their due diligence and find her ID and he didn't have it the whole time.
Exactly. So, it's still possible that she could have been pulled over by a police officer or police impersonator. This doesn't rule that out as a possibility. But at the same time, I think it made investigators really question the assumptions that they had made and that their whole theory about Officer Byrne had been built on.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
The revelation about the missing license wasn't the only thing Corneal discovered either. It seemed that the former detective was a pretty savvy investigator. Scott, remember the security guard who reported that he'd witnessed Lisa arguing with her boyfriend Doug at about 11 p.m. on the night of her murder?
I do.
Well, Corneal, by then acting in his role as a private investigator, was actually the first person to speak to that security guard about the night of Lisa's murder. Corneal was actually the one who discovered that Lisa and Doug had had a fight that night. Because investigators from Honolulu PD hadn't spoken to him, they didn't know that, and they didn't speak to the security guard at all until after Corneal had interviewed him and discovered the thing about the fight. And that's not all, either. Corneal also spoke to another witness and had her testify before the grand jury. Her name was Charlotte Kamaka, and she was a newspaper delivery woman who'd witnessed something strange on the night of Lisa's murder. Now, Charlotte had reported what she'd seen to police as soon as Lisa's body had been discovered. However, according to Hawaii News Now, Charlotte later explained that when she told a detective what she'd witnessed, he simply wrote down her contact information and that was it. No one ever followed up with her. She had even called the department several times herself in an attempt to follow up because she thought it was such a big deal, but nothing came of it. It wasn't until later when Corneal contacted her that she felt like anyone took her story seriously.
It's really painting this investigation in a new light.
Yeah. At the beginning of an investigation, it's really important that investigators be open to all possibilities and not latch onto one theory and get tunnel vision, because you could miss important things, including the truth, if you do that. But unfortunately, it looks like that's what happened here.
I mean, we've talked about it a number of times, even in some of our more recent episodes, how there are times when officers go back and revisit their older cases just to make sure they don't miss anything because of how important that kind of thing is. It's very easy to laser focus on one person, no matter how incorrect that option is.
Yes. So Charlotte's story went like this. On the night of Lisa's murder, Charlotte, who was apparently an extremely dedicated newspaper delivery person, had been out on her usual delivery route, braving the rain and mudslides. At approximately 2 a.m., she'd witnessed a white or possibly mixed-race man driving a blue car with a female passenger in the passenger seat. The thing that caught Charlotte's eye was the way the female passenger's head had lolled, as if she had been dead asleep, or maybe, even in retrospect, actually dead. When the driver had made a turn, the woman's head had flopped, and she'd shown no sign of waking up. A short while later, Charlotte had seen the same blue car a second time. It had been turning around in a gravel overlook, and the driver had been alone. The female passenger had been nowhere to be seen. And this all happened on Mount Tantalus. Charlotte had been able to get a pretty good look at the driver that time, and he'd returned her gaze, just staring at her for a while before driving away into the stormy night. Charlotte would later identify a man out of a photo lineup as the same man who she believed she'd seen behind the wheel of that vehicle, and that man became the second suspect. The primary suspect, for that matter, as far as Corneal was concerned.
Okay.
I can't officially tell you who the second suspect was because articles on this case don't explicitly state the name of the second suspect. However, Corneal did present evidence against the second suspect to the grand jury, And as you mentioned earlier, Scott, grand jury proceedings are highly secretive. However, although this second suspect who was discussed during grand jury proceedings hasn't been officially publicly identified, Lisa's boyfriend, Doug, has publicly acknowledged that he himself was at one time considered a suspect. Additionally, one detail that's been revealed in reporting about the second suspect is the fact that he failed 2 polygraph tests given to him by the Honolulu police. And guess who has been publicly identified as having failed 2 polygraph tests in relation to Lisa's murder?
I can only guess it's Doug.
That's right, Doug, her boyfriend. So it sounds as if Doug may have been the second suspect. Of course, it's possible that there was someone else who was also considered a suspect and who also failed polygraph examinations twice. But with that being said, the only suspects I've found to be named in public records are Officer Byrne and Doug, so it stands to reason that Doug may have been the second suspect who Corneal presented evidence regarding during the investigative grand jury proceedings. And it's important to note that whoever the second suspect was the same person who Charlotte Kamaka ID'd during a lineup as the driver of the car she'd witnessed transporting an unconscious woman.
Okay, I'm going to touch on Doug for a moment here.
Mm-hmm.
And if he really did have a fight with her, he really did have a short drive and he made it home, there's a lot of unanswered questions around him. I mean, we don't really know a lot about what his alibi for him being at the apartment at the time is, or much about the investigation into him because they were so laser focused on Officer Byrne.
Right.
However, it does make sense that Doug would be one of the people that was shown in a photo lineup because it's somebody that she had regular contact with.
Yeah, they were dating, they fought, and he was the last person to see her alive. And he was a white male.
I can definitely see some of those, and I wish we had more information about him as a suspect and that aspect of the investigation.
Well, I do have some more information about him. When it comes to Doug as a potential suspect, it is no surprise that he was considered. Statistically speaking, women are more likely to be murdered by men they know, often their intimate partners, than by anyone else. A husband or boyfriend is often where police will start their investigation when a woman is murdered. And about those 2 polygraph exams that Doug failed. First of all, polygraphs are pseudoscientific. We know that, so a suspect failing them is not damning. What's interesting, though, is that investigators asked Doug about his results, and he told them that there was a simple explanation for his failure. He felt guilty. Guilty because he'd allowed Lisa, who was a new driver, to drive home on her own despite the storm that had been raging that night. If he'd driven her home instead, he said, maybe she wouldn't have died. At the time, investigators readily accepted this explanation. Detective Lum, the officer assigned to Lisa's case during its heyday, has publicly stated that he had no issue accepting this explanation because he didn't believe Doug had committed the murder. He believed that Doug had no motive to kill Lisa. According to an article from Hawaii News Now, Lum said regarding Doug, quote, "There was no third party involved. There was no money involved. There was no baby coming. There was no reason for him to do it." End quote.
Well, while all of that may be true, that's not the only motivation somebody has. Like, people don't need any of those really strong motivations. Sometimes people just kill each other.
Yeah, Detective Lum's explanation sounds pretty asinine in retrospect. And by the way, I assume that he was the one really pushing the Officer Byrne thing, and Officer Byrne didn't have any of those motivators either, so...
Yeah, it really does feel very dismissive.
Yeah, as we know, domestic violence is not always logical, and it's not just women who are engaged in affairs, or who have life insurance policies, or who are pregnant who are murdered. Often, domestic disputes are based in suspicions or circumstances that may seem bizarre to outsiders.
And there was an argument.
Right, we know that Lisa and Doug fought that night, so tempers flared. Sometimes that's all it takes.
One thing to remember when it comes to how domestic violence is handled and how it was viewed is the context of the 80s. It wasn't really taken as seriously as it is today.
That's a very good point.
So while I don't agree with how dismissive it was, I totally understand why it was seen that way at the time.
We certainly know a lot more about it now than we did in the law enforcement world back then.
It has rightfully become much more important and taken more seriously in today's society because it's a key indicator for so many different things.
Right.
But that's not to say that Doug is a domestic abuser or he's engaged in domestic violence. It's just a comment on how the argument may have been misinterpreted or shied away from by officers at the time.
Right. Also of note is the fact that at the time of Lisa's murder, Doug had reportedly been attempting to end their relationship. According to what he told police anyway, he'd felt that he and Lisa had been heading in different directions in life. While Lisa had been happy working in a skilled trade on the island, Doug had been studying at a university and had had plans to continue his education and launch a career that would take him far away from the shores of Oahu. In the future, he'd reasoned, he and Lisa wouldn't be compatible. They wanted different things out of life. It's also important to mention that immediately after Lisa's death, Doug had reportedly had scratches on his face, which, in my opinion, is the biggest red flag in this entire investigation, at least that we know of.
That's hard to explain.
Right. I don't know what explanation he gave, if any, to investigators regarding the scratches. I couldn't find any reporting on that. According to reporting by Lynn Kawano for Hawaii News Now, Doug ended up finishing his education at a faraway college in Australia. He remained in the country and went on to work in an executive role at an investment firm where he remains today.
The obvious question I have is, how soon after her murder did he change universities and move?
I wondered the same thing, and I did do a little research, but I could not pinpoint an exact time, so I don't want to speculate. So, could Doug have been responsible for Lisa's death? It's a compelling theory that persists to this day in the minds of curious parties, but it is not the only one. Some people have speculated that Lisa's death may not have occurred at the hands of a police officer or a boyfriend. It's possible, some believe, that her murder may have been the work of a serial killer known as the Honolulu Strangler or, sometimes, the Honolulu Rapist. The Honolulu Strangler is an unidentified murderer who's considered Hawaii's first known serial killer. During the years of 1985 and 1986, the Honolulu Strangler is believed to have murdered at least 5 women on the island of Oahu. Now, that's a lot of serial murder for such a small landmass during such an abbreviated period of time. For perspective, the island of Oahu is 597 square miles, or approximately 1,545 square kilometers in size. That's roughly the same size by square miles as the city of Houston, Texas. And that's by landmass. By population, the island of Oahu is less than half the size of Houston. In 1982, Oahu was home to approximately 762,000 people. However, despite the fact that the Honolulu Strangler was operating within a relatively small area, literally an island, they have yet to be identified or caught. Women commonly believed to be victims of the Honolulu Strangler include Vicky Purdy, Regina Sakamoto, Denise Hughes, Luis Medeiros, and Linda Pierce. All of these women were young, ranging in age from 17 to 36, and fell victim to an opportunistic killer who often strangled and/or sexually assaulted his victims. The problem was so bad that Oahu law enforcement paired with the FBI to form a serial killer task force with help from the Green River Killer Task Force. That's the law enforcement team who took down well-known serial killer Gary Ridgway in Washington state.
Okay.
The Honolulu Stranglers' suspected 5 victims were all killed during the years of 1985 and 1986. Some suspect that Lisa, who was murdered in 1982, may have been an earlier victim of his. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that we don't know Lisa's cause of death or whether or not she was sexually assaulted. The only information that's been publicly released regarding the state of her remains at the time of the discovery is that her body was nude and that decomposition was well underway. While the nudity suggests the possibility of sexual assault and/or a sexually motivated killing, it does not prove it.
So I've been kind of holding back a theory, and
Okay.
the 2-year thing really kind of gets the gears ticking, if you will.
It's a pretty short period of time. What made him stop is the question that I have.
It's something that came up when we first started talking about this case. The thought that there is a large military presence in Oahu.
Right. They deployed military members to search for Lisa.
So the thought arises that it may not have been a Honolulu police officer, but it could have been a military police officer, which they probably wouldn't have even checked into very much.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting theory. I hadn't thought of that.
And when we're talking about the serial killer side of this, 2 years, that could very easily match up with a military deployment to Hawaii.
Sure, he might have been stationed somewhere else after that. That's really compelling. I mean, even if not a military police officer, just a military member in general, it makes you think, was the Honolulu Strangler a member of the military? Because if he was, that could explain why his killing period, at least that we know of, was so abbreviated.
Yeah, I really wonder how he would compare and line up to some of the other known serial killers we have, and if it could have possibly been a different serial killer that continued killing after he left Hawaii.
That's very interesting.
But that being said, that 2-year time frame, if it was a military member, he may not have been involved with Lisa's, but that doesn't mean that a different military member could have been responsible.
Sure. And that can make it harder to identify a suspect in a case when you have this rotating selection of men who are filtering on and off the island because of the military presence. That complicates things.
I will say, when it comes to being out in the weather that was going on when Lisa was murdered, I would see military members and military personnel being more suited to being used to or operating in that kind of weather anyways.
Right. Getting whatever they're setting out to do done, even in poor conditions. We're probably talking about, a young man who might not shy away from a storm.
I could definitely see the thought process behind there being a bad storm and somebody seeing it as an opportunity to find somebody that would be a good victim.
Yeah, possibly, because visibility is going to be reduced due to the heavy rain, and there are going to be fewer people on the roads. But with that being said, there's always someone, and they might even find someone pulled over because of the conditions. So on the note of Lisa's cause of death, as I mentioned earlier, after her body was discovered, the medical examiner claimed that they couldn't determine a cause of death because of the significant decomposition her remains had already undergone. Given that she'd only been dead for 10 days, however, this seemed a little surprising and definitely disappointing. A little over a year after her death, Lisa's remains were exhumed so that a second opinion could be obtained regarding her cause of death. This time, law enforcement asked the Los Angeles coroner to attempt to determine her cause of death, and they agreed to do so. The first thing investigators discovered when Lisa's body was exhumed was that she'd been interred inside of the police body bag she'd been placed in at the crime scene. And inside the bag were leaves, dirt, and other detritus from the mountainside ravine where she'd been discovered by that guy walking his dog. Her body had never been cleaned or washed at all. It had literally been buried just as it had been found.
That sounds strange, since an examination was supposed to happen.
Right.
It seems odd that they would remove her and then just put her back in the bag.
Right. These findings begged the question, how thoroughly had her remains even been examined in the first place? Had they been examined at all? Or, potentially, I'm wondering, had the medical examiner looked at the remains and been like, oh, nope, it's been too long. I'm just going to chalk this up to decomposition, ruling out the possibility of a definitive diagnosis.
Kind of like a field examination.
I do know that the coroner responded and did a field examination at the site where her body was found. So that occurred. I am wondering if any further examination actually occurred after her remains were taken back to his office.
Well, the thought arises, did he make the decision that he was going to be unable to make that determination while he was out there in the field?
Yeah, and never did anything. I don't know. I'm wondering. Now, I wish I could tell you that the LA County coroner was able to come back with a definitive cause of death for Lisa. However, the results of the exhumation and subsequent exam were never made public. All I can tell you is that the LA County coroner told media that the advanced state of decomposition, which of course was even greater with more than a year having passed, would make identifying a cause of death very difficult. Now, Hawaii is fortunate enough to have a world-class forensic anthropologist who teaches at the University of Hawaii, Dr. Robert Mann. Dr. Mann, who's personally examined the remains of Jeffrey Dahmer's first victim, September 11th terrorist attack victims, and even Tomb of the Lost Soldier remains, to name just a few of his accomplishments, has expressed a willingness to examine Lisa's remains in an attempt to determine a cause of death. Unfortunately, and outrageously though, that might not be possible. Scott, I know you're remembering from the first time we recorded on this case.
This overwhelming wave of disappointment just flooded over me because I just suddenly remembered what happened.
Right. So I say that because, as you're obviously recalling right now, there is some debate over where exactly Lisa's skull and lower mandible are. They've possibly been lost. It's possible that the skull and mandible were reinterred along with her remains after that second examination, but nobody knows for sure. So the only way to even find out if they've been lost or not would be to exhume her remains and see if they're there. Now, so far, that has not been done. So far, Dr. Mann has not had an opportunity to examine Lisa's remains. Whether another exhumation will be performed and whether her skull will be there and he'll ever get the chance remains to be seen. Now, back to the Honolulu Strangler theory. Even without knowing whether Lisa's body bore any signs of sexual assault or other hallmarks of the Honolulu Strangler's crimes, such as binding, the possibility of the Honolulu Strangler being responsible for her death is one that many curious minds find compelling. On that note, as I hinted at earlier, the identity of the Honolulu Strangler is not officially known. However, police did set their sights on a suspect after the death of the Strangler's fifth known victim, Linda. The really interesting thing is that the suspect literally delivered himself right into investigators' hands. Anyone familiar with true crime knows it's common for self-proclaimed psychics to contact police after murders or disappearances occur, claiming to know where the victim is. For many of these alleged clairvoyants, it's a numbers game. If they're one of the many whose predictions turn out to be false, they're quickly forgotten by investigators and the public is none the wiser. But if they happen to guess correctly, they've hit the jackpot. The accuracy of their prediction is something they can tout as proof of their psychic abilities. Linda's murder was one of those cases that attracted claims of psychic knowledge, but not just in the usual way. A man named Howard Gay Dutcher contacted police, and although he didn't claim to be psychic himself, he told investigators that a psychic he'd spoken to had told him, for some strange reason, the location of Linda's body.
Okay, so I'm not going to take anything away from self-proclaimed psychics. Sometimes there's unusual stuff that happens, right? But I think we can go ahead and say that even amongst that crowd, this is an incredible outlier.
This is weird, no matter how you look at it. But police allowed Dutcher to lead them to a place called Sand Island. And although Linda's body wasn't in the exact spot that Dutcher identified, they later did find it in another place on Sand Island. Of course, police didn't believe Dutcher's psychic story, and he became their primary suspect. When investigators spoke to Dutcher's wife, she told them that Dutcher was interested in sexual bondage and liked to tie her hands behind her back before engaging in intercourse with her. This was noteworthy because several of the Honolulu Strangler victims had been found with their hands tied behind their backs. Dutcher's wife also said that he was a smooth talker and that a couple of the Honolulu Strangler murders had happened on nights when she and her husband had fought, which of course raises the question. After storming out of their house, had Dutcher taken out his anger on vulnerable women who'd happened to stumble across his path? Investigators thought so, and although they arrested Dutcher, they ultimately released him after deciding that they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him for any of the murders they thought he had committed. In 2012, Dutcher died, taking any information he may or may not have had to the grave. So that's the serial killer theory. And again, even if Dutcher was the Honolulu Strangler, we do not know whether the Honolulu Strangler was involved in Lisa's death. It is only one of several theories. Now, circling back to the killer cop theory, there's one more thing I've got to mention. Some people still firmly believe that Lisa was murdered by a cop, just maybe not Officer Byrne, the guy who was originally accused. Officer Byrne, some speculate, may simply have been a scapegoat framed by his own department in order to cover for another officer, which begs the question, why would they do that? And the answer depends on who you ask. There's a conspiracy theory out there that centers around an alleged drug ring being facilitated or even run by members of the Honolulu Police Department. Some theorize that Officer Byrne may have had knowledge of the drug ring, and that in order to eliminate the threat, some other officers may have conspired to frame him for a murder, Lisa's murder. Personally, I'm not sure that would be a very logical way to get Officer Byrne out of the picture if that was what someone wanted to do. For one, why bother killing an innocent woman and framing Officer Byrne for it? Why not just kill Officer Byrne outright?
Yeah, I think that would be much easier to play off. And personally, if I'm working for a department, I discover a drug ring and then they try to silence me by coming up with criminal charges and destroying my reputation and integrity, I'm probably going to start giving irrefutable evidence of this drug ring out.
Right. You'd start talking. Probably anyone would in that scenario. So another, perhaps more logical spin on the framing theory posits that another officer may have simply been a sick, opportunistic murderer, and that maybe that officer was more powerful or better liked than Officer Byrne and was able to gain cooperation from others when it came to framing poor Officer Byrne for his crime. I've got to mention, though, drug scandal has struck Honolulu law enforcement before. If you're interested, just look up the drug trafficking scandal that involved a former police chief, a prosecuting attorney, and others in Honolulu law enforcement. It wound up in federal court in 2019, and media coverage has provided quite the expose on law enforcement corruption in the Aloha state. While this particular scandal erupted decades after Lisa's murder, it serves as a reminder that corruption can strike anywhere, including within the highest ranks of law enforcement. So with that in mind, it's not difficult to understand where people are coming from with conspiracy theories regarding Lisa's murder.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that it doesn't necessarily have to be a conspiracy cover-up here. It could have been another officer that had taken the opportunity to kill Lisa, and he was just quiet enough about it that he avoided suspicion. And when Officer Byrne came up, there was the public pressure, so they put their blinders on, and they never even investigated this other officer. And it wasn't a cover-up at all. It was just not doing a thorough enough job with the investigation.
That's a great point. Also very possible. So, what really happened to Lisa? Was her murder one of the many domestic homicides that take the lives of thousands of American women every year? Or was her killer an authority figure? Or a serial killer? Her family and friends are still asking these questions decades later. The tremendous pain and suffering her death inflicted upon her family contributed to her parents eventually divorcing, and both of them have sadly since died without ever seeing justice served in their daughter's case. Lisa had other people in her life, though, her sister, for example, and of course, other family members and friends who loved her. They deserve to know the truth about her death, and whoever killed Lisa, if still alive, deserves to be held responsible. If you know anything about what happened to Lisa Au, please call the Honolulu Police Department at 808-529-3111 and share what you know. Or, if you prefer, you can visit their website, honolulupd.org, and fill out the email contact form available there.
That's all for this episode of Lasting Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastingalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Lasting Alive Podcast. Episodes of Lasting Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Lisa's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Lasting Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store, where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Lasting Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.